We're looking at some high-stakes diplomacy in the Horn of Africa,
High stakes is right, yeah.
with this meeting between Egypt, Somalia, and Eritrea.
And what makes this really interesting is these three, they've got this tangled history with each other.
Yeah.
And with Ethiopia, even though Ethiopia wasn't actually at the summit,
Right, lurking in the background.
its shadow.
It's like everyone's kind of sizing each other up, try to
So
make their next move in this region that is constantly changing.
it's all about strategy.
So to even start to untangle this, maybe we need to zoom out a little,
Yeah.
give people a quick snapshot of the Horn of Africa itself.
Yeah, for sure. When we talk about the Horn of Africa, we're talking Easter Africa, right? Up against the Red Sea, which, by the way, super important for global trade. Everyone's ships go through there.
Right, a choke point.
Huge. And this region, it's been grappling with conflict, instability, you name it, for decades.
And not to mention, I mean, you've got a major conflict happening right now in Sudan.
Exactly. The civil war in Sudan is a perfect example of how quickly things can explode in the Horn. And that instability, it spreads. Look at Somalia. They're still fighting al-Shabaab.
Right, so with all that going on as background noise,
Yeah.
what makes this summit, this particular meeting, such a big deal?
Well, you've got these three players, right? Egypt, Somalia, Eritrea, each with their own reasons for showing up. But the common thread, it's about who has the most influence in the region
Okay.
and the timing. Couldn't be more interesting, especially with Egypt's worries about the GR.
Ah, yes, the GERD. Let's break that down a little. That's the big dam project, right? The one causing tension between Egypt and Ethiopia.
That's the one. And it all boils down to the Nile River.
Right.
Egypt relies on the Nile. I mean, for everything, agriculture, industry, you name it. It's their lifeblood. And this dam that Ethiopia is building, it's got Cairo really concerned about water shortages down the line.
So are you saying that Egypt sees this dam as an actual threat to their survival?
I wouldn't say that's an overstatement, no.
Yeah.
And that's why they're making these power plays like that defense pact with Somalia.
Yeah, because this pact, it's not just talk.
Not just words.
Egypt's actually sending weapons to Mogadishu.
Exactly. And that's a signal. They're saying, we're willing to use force to protect our interests.
That's-
But it's not just about water, right? This is about who calls the shots in the region.
So Egypt sees Ethiopia's influence growing,
Mm-hmm.
and they're trying to, build up their own coalition?
Basically. And that's where this summit comes in. Get chummy with Somalia, with Eritrea, and suddenly you've got a bloc that can challenge Ethiopia.
But meanwhile, you've got Somalia caught in the middle, right?
Oh, yeah.
They've got their own problems, al-Shabaab being a big one, and now they're being asked to pick a side in this power struggle.
And to make things even spicier, Somalia made a pretty controversial deal with Ethiopia recently, didn't they?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The Somaliland situation.
That's the one.
Which, I've got to admit, even I was scratching my head a little.
It's a complicated one.
So for our listeners who haven't been following every twist and turn, can you give us the rundown?
Sure. So Somaliland, it's this region in Somalia that basically said, see ya later, back in 91, declared independence. But here's the thing. Most of the world doesn't recognize it.
Right, it's this weird limbo.
Exactly. And Somalia's always insisted Somaliland is theirs. But recently, they made a deal. They said to Ethiopia, hey, you give us access to some of your ports on the Red Sea.
Which I'm assuming would be a big economic boost for Somalia.
Huge. And we'll recognize Somaliland's independence.
Talk about a trade-off. I mean, that's huge for Somalia, if they can get those ports up and running.
Huge, but risky.
But at the risk of angering Egypt.
That's the gamble.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up.
And it just shows you the tightrope Somalia is walking, right?
Oh.
Try to keep everyone happy, play the long game, but one wrong step.
You're in trouble. So, speaking of keeping everyone happy, where does Eritrea fit into all of this? They've had, shall we say, a bit of a rocky past with Ethiopia.
That's an understatement. I mean, they were actually part of Ethiopia for a while. Fought a long, brutal war for independence back in '93.
Right, and even since then.
Border clashes, military skirmishes, the whole 9 yards. And more recently, Eritrea joined forces with Ethiopia against the TPLF.
Yeah, during that conflict in the Tigray region. So with all that history, You'd think they'd be closer to Ethiopia, not cozying up to Egypt at this summit.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, right? But remember, Eritrea's involvement in Tigray, it was about their own security. They see the TPLF as a threat.
Ah,
So sure, they were fighting on the same side for a minute, but that doesn't erase decades of suspicion.
so Eritrea's still got their doubts about Ethiopia.
Big time. They see Ethiopia flexing its muscles, and they're looking for ways to push back. And Egypt, convenient ally in that regard.
So for Eritrea, this summit, it's less about picking a side in this whole Egypt-Ethiopia rivalry and more about looking out for number one.
Exactly. Don't forget, Eritrea's been pretty isolated on the world stage. Sanctions, human rights criticisms, the works. This summit, chance to make some friends, maybe open some economic doors.
Like get back in the game.
Exactly. Improve their standing.
So everyone came to this party with their own playlist, their own anxieties. But what about the party itself? Did anything actually happen, or was it just a bunch of handshakes and photo ops?
Oh, there were definitely some takeaways. They put out a joint statement, and while it was a little vague on the details, it did give us some hints about their priorities.
Okay, lay it on me. What do they agree on?
First and foremost, peace and security in the Horn of Africa.
Okay, that seems a little generic, right? I mean, who doesn't want peace and security?
True, but given the current climate, it's not nothing.
Because right now, the Horn of Africa is pretty much the opposite of peaceful.
Right, so it's a way for them to say, hey, we see the problems, and we're on the same page about fixing them.
Projecting an image of unity?
Exactly. Which is interesting because the next thing they emphasized was non-interference in each other's business.
Now that sounds like it could be a dig at Ethiopia, right? With the whole Somaliland deal.
It's not out of the realm of possibility. Remember, Egypt wasn't thrilled about that, so maybe this is their way of saying back off, but in a more diplomatic way.
Right, gotta save face.
Exactly. But it's worth noting, non-interference, it's a two-way street. Protects Somalia, Eritrea too.
Like setting some ground rules for the relationship, but keeping things a little fuzzy around the edges.
Exactly. And then, the big one, they're setting up a joint committee for strategic cooperation.
Okay, so what does that mean in plain English? What's this committee actually going to do?
The details, still a little murky. But it tells us they're serious about working together, maybe on things like security, trade, who knows, even sharing intel on terrorist groups.
So, big picture time. What does this summit tell us about the future of the Horn of Africa? Is this the start of a beautiful friendship, or are we just watching a new alliance form against Ethiopia?
Million-dollar question. And honestly, it could be a bit of both. These countries, they're looking out for themselves, first and foremost.
All right.
And teaming up. It lets them pool their resources, face down shared threats, have a bigger say in things.
But there's a ton of uncertainty still. How's Ethiopia going to react to this little club they've formed? And what about the bigger players, the African Union, the U.S.? Are they just going to sit on the sidelines?
You've hit on a key point. This isn't just about these three countries. It's about a whole web of international actors, each with their own agenda.
And the African Union? They've already got their hands full with the situation in Sudan.
Oh, absolutely. Last thing they want is another major crisis.
Right. Like, can't you guys just work it out?
Exactly. And then you've got the global heavy hitters, right? U.S., China, Russia. They've all been poking around the horn more and more lately.
And those guys, they don't just poke, they
make waves.
Yeah.
And those waves, they can shift the whole power dynamic.
So there's a ripple effect, right?
Yeah.
You've got these three countries making a move, but then it bumps up against all these other interests.
It's a chain reaction.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so, I don't know, fascinating, but also kind of unnerving.
Oh, for sure. It's a reminder that we're all connected, right? Something happens over here, and it can have consequences way over there.
So if we zoom back in on this trilateral partnership, this new alliance, what do you think it means for the balance of power in the Horn?
Well, if they can actually make it work, if Egypt, Somalia, and Eritrea can present a united front, it could definitely chip away at Ethiopia's dominance.
And that would have huge implications for everything we've been talking about, right? The damn negotiations, trade deals, even the fight against terrorism.
Oh, absolutely. But, and this is a big but, Ethiopia is not just going to roll over.
They've got their own cards to play.
Exactly. So, yeah, buckle up, Buttercup. This roller coaster's still got a few twists and turns left.
This summit, it's like they just added another loop-de-loop to an already wild ride.
And as we've seen, even the smallest bump can send things flying off the rails in the Horn.
So much potential, but so much risk.
That's the Horn in a nutshell.
I have a feeling we'll be talking about this again soon, but for now, I think you've given us plenty to digest. The Horn of Africa, a place that most people probably couldn't even point to on a map.
And now everyone's watching.
Exactly. It's a reminder that some of the most important stories, they're not always happening in the spotlight.
They're happening in the shadows.
Exactly. It's on us to pay attention to try to understand because, like you said, we're all connected.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, to say the least. And to our listener who sent in this article, thank you. Keep them coming. You never know where they might take us.
Always appreciate a good mystery.
That's the deep dive. Signing off for now.